On the 9th of May, 1940, at 2100 hours, the codeword Danzig is issued to the Wehrmacht, initiating Fall Gelb. The next morning at 02:45, the invasion of France begins. On that same day, Neville Chamberlain resigns as Prime Minister of Great Britain and Winston Churchill takes power. What was it that he was trying to do, and how was he going to do it? We look at the centre of gravity under the Churchill government. Ladies and gentlemen, last episode we looked at the Chamberlain government and its centre of gravity. The desired end state for Chamberlain was enduring peace. And we looked at the DIME construct, which is the instruments of national strategic policy, diplomacy, information, military and economic. And the problem with the Chamberlain government was that you can't use unrestrained military power if your desired end state is the avoidance of war. Chamberlain was so keen to avoid war that in an effort to not provoke Hitler into further attacks, the underinvestment in the military continued even after the invasion of Poland. In fact, the unemployment rate rose even though there was a huge demand for equipment that needed to be manufactured, and of course, the ranks of the military, particularly the army, needed to be increased massively. We described the centre of gravity for the Chamberlain government and for the British as being a coordinated use of the tools of national strategy. The mistake that he made was to select an end state that his means had no way of delivering. This ties in nicely with our ends, ways and means process for analysing centre of gravity. Now, I don't think it's a great analysis of the centre of gravity, but having said that, it wasn't a great centre of gravity, whatever it was, because Britain was unable to avoid war. Chamberlain's wait-and-see strategy and his economic policy of laissez-faire meant that he ceded the military initiative to Germany, and the mistakes that this created were so severe that Robin Pryor, in his book, wrote, "As it happened, the first existential threat to the continuation of the British state as a liberal democracy was the Chamberlain government itself." Germany had invaded Poland on the 1st of September 1939, and since then, the phony war had been fought between France, Britain, and Germany, with very little movement occurring across the borders. Belgium and the Netherlands remained neutral. The Norwegian campaign had commenced on the 8th of April, with the Germans attempting to seize Norway, in particular Narvik, so that they could secure their iron ore supplies. The British were attempting to defend Norway. From the 7th to the 9th of May, a debate was held in the British House of Commons, which would go on to be called the Norway debate. On the end of the debate on the 8th of May, there was a division of the House for a no-confidence motion. The Chamberlain government, the Conservative government, survived, however its margin was significantly reduced. Chamberlain was increasingly seen to have missed the bus when it came to dealing with Hitler and German expansion. This phrase came from Chamberlain himself, who a month earlier had said that Hitler had missed the bus, but now as the strategic picture worsened, it was becoming increasingly clear that it was Chamberlain and not Hitler who had missed the bus. This led Chamberlain to resign on the 10th of May, and Churchill became the wartime leader of the British government. Up until this point, he'd been serving in the government as the First Sea Lord. But for a significant amount of time now, he was one of the few voices who had recognised the threat that Nazi Germany represented to Great Britain and indeed to the Western democracies. I think it's important to place the importance of the 10th of May and the formation of the Churchill government into some sort of temporal context. There were many things that Churchill needed to do. Among them was to create a war ministry. This was going to need to be a coalition government. He was also going to need to come up with a strategy, a national strategy, a military strategy to be able to counter Nazi expansionism and indeed defeat the Nazis. Churchill formed a 5-man war cabinet, and it included Chamberlain, who after becoming Prime Minister would step down to become Lord President of the Council. the Labour leader, Clement Attlee, as Lord Privy Seal, and he would later go on to become the Deputy Prime Minister, Halifax as the Foreign Secretary, and Labour's Arthur Greenwood as a Minister without portfolio. This makes the 10th of May 1940 an incredibly significant day in the history of Winston Churchill and indeed Great Britain. However, also on the 10th of May, the Wehrmacht invades France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. The 8-month-long phony war had just gotten kinetic. The time pressure that Churchill is now under is immense as he tries to work out what the military strategy is and as he tries to work out how he is going to boost the economy onto a wartime footing. Not only does the 10th of May represent a change of government in Britain, it also sees a change in strategy, a change in desired end state, and that is going to bring about a change in centre of gravity. So let's have a look at what the desired end state is of the new Churchill government. This is an excerpt from a speech that Churchill gave to the House of Commons on the 13th of May, 1940. So only 3 days in to his premiership.
You ask what is our policy? I will say it is to wage war by sea, land and air, with all our might and with all the strength that God can give us. To wage war against a monstrous tyranny never surpassed in the dark and lamentable catalogue of human crime. That is our policy. You ask, what is our aim? I can answer in one word: victory. Victory at all costs. Victory in spite of all terror. Victory however long and hard the road may be. For without victory there is no survival. Let that be realized. No survival for the British Empire. No survival for all that the British Empire stood for. No survival for the urge and impulse of the ages that mankind will move forward towards its goal. But I take up my task with buoyancy and hope. I feel sure that our cause will not be suffered to fail among men. At this time I feel entitled to claim the aid of all. And I say, come then, let us go forward together with our united strength.
This is a succinct distillation of the genius of Churchill. We have a very clear end state. It is victory. Victory at all costs, victory in spite of all terror, victory however long and hard the road may be, for without victory there is no survival. Not only has he made the end state crystal clear, he has said why it is so important, because there would be no survival for the British Empire. What is the way that he intends to bring around this desired end state? It is to wage war by sea, land and air with all our might and with all the strength that God can give us, to wage war against a monstrous tyranny never surpassed in the lamentable catalogue of human crime. As we look at our ends, ways and means methodology for identifying the centre of gravity, we can see that Churchill is not really likely to be a centre of gravity in himself. And I think he understands this. Let's go back to a little bit earlier in the speech where he describes his role. Remember, this speech is only 3 days after the invasion of France, and Churchill alludes to some of the time pressure that he's been under.
In this crisis, I hope I may be pardoned if I do not address the House at any length today. I hope that any of my friends and colleagues or former colleagues who are affected by the political reconstruction will make all allowances for any lack of ceremony with which it has been necessary to act. I would say to the House, as I said to those who have joined the government, I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. We have before us an ordeal of the most grievous kind. We have before us many, many long months of struggle and of suffering.
So if it's not Churchill, then what else could it be? Remembering that we're trying to identify the centre of gravity at the national strategic level. It's probably not going to be a military centre of gravity. The British Army is quite small. It's a lot smaller than it appears on paper because there are still a large number of troops who are in training, and many of them don't have all of the equipment that they need to go into battle. And it pales into insignificance in comparison to the French army, and indeed, more importantly, to that of the German army. The RAF has still been significantly underinvested in. It is starting to spool up, but it is a long way away from being able to impact at a strategic level the conduct of the war. It is short the bombers, it is short the fighters, and it is short the pilots and the doctrine that it will need to influence the outcome of the war. That leaves the Royal Navy. The Royal Navy is a very different case. It is much bigger than the Kriegsmarine, although in 1940 we don't really know how the war is going to be conducted, nor how well positioned the Royal Navy is to fight that war. This raises the spectre of carrier aviation, naval aviation in general, and the U-boats. Churchill probably wasn't thinking about this on the 10th of May. The means that Churchill has at hand are not sufficient to achieve the desired end state, but Churchill has identified a means that is going to enable the British to achieve victory. And he actually alludes to it at the end of this speech. Let's just re-listen to the last two sentences.
I feel sure that our cause will not be suffered to fail among men. At this time I feel entitled to claim the aid of all. And I say, come then, let us go forward together with our united strength.
I feel sure that our cause will not be suffered to fail among men. This is a call to arms. And he says, at this time, I feel entitled to claim the aid of all. And I say, come then, let us go forward together with our united strength. What Churchill is doing here is building the community of interest that is going to be a requirement for him to put together a coalition. Now, he already has a coalition. The BEF is fighting alongside the Dutch, the Belgians, and the French. And this is only the 13th of May. We're only 3 days into the German invasion. But this coalition won't be as long-lived as Churchill would have been hoping for. Let's skip forward 3 and a bit weeks as we look at the speech that Churchill gave to the House of Commons on the 4th of June 1940.
When Napoleon lay at Boulogne for a year with his flat-bottom boats and his grand army, he was told by someone, there are bitter weeds in England. There are certainly a great many more of them since the British expeditionary force returned. Sir, I have myself full confidence that if all do their duty, if nothing is neglected, and if the best arrangements are made, as they are being made, we shall prove ourselves once more able to defend our island home, to ride out the storm of war, and to outlive the menace of tyranny, if necessary for years, if necessary alone. At any rate, that is what we are going to try to do. That is the resolve of His Majesty's government, every man of them. That is the will of Parliament and the nation. The British Empire and the French Republic, linked together in their cause and in their need, will defend to the death their native soil, aiding each other like good comrades to the utmost of their strength. We shall go on to the end. We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender. And if, which I do not for a moment believe, this island or a large part of it were subjugated and starving, then our empire beyond the seas, armed and guarded by the British fleet, would carry on the struggle until, in God's good time, the new world, with all its power and might, steps forth to the rescue and the liberation of the old.
This speech was given just 24 hours after the last British troops were evacuated from Dunkirk, and it highlights a couple of points. Firstly, the importance of those troops coming back to Britain to be able to carry on the defence. This is important from an operational point of view, a military strategic point of view, and from a national strategic point of view, because Churchill may not have been able to hold on to government had the BEF been entirely lost in France. His oration aimed at increasing the morale of the British people and also signalling the expectation that the new world, and that means the United States, will come to rescue the old world from the tyranny that it is facing. This and many of the other public and private communications between Churchill and the American people, and in particular President Roosevelt, are shaping actions, information actions aimed at creating and highlighting the importance of this community interest to bring the United States into the war on the side of Great Britain. On the 10th of May, I don't think Churchill was expecting the Battle of France to go so badly. However, he may have been expecting the war to pan out in the way that the French were expecting it to, and that is a long, drawn-out battle. Remembering, of course, that the French, during World War I, the entirety of the war had been fought on their terrain. The French were planning, expecting to halt the German invasion, and then be required to fight a significant defensive battle that was going to take a significant amount of time. It would have been expected that between the Dutch, the Belgians, the French, and the British, that coalition should have been able to generate sufficient combat power to be able to halt the German invasion. This second speech was given on the 10th of June. The French government would only last another 15 days. It surrendered on the 25th of June, leaving Britain alone to face the might of the Germans. From our point of view, looking at the Battle of France 1940, the centre of gravity as the coalition between the countries currently involved in hostilities, I think, is as far as we need to go. However, I think that there's some really interesting lessons to be learned at the strategic level, and also about resilience, particularly the resilience of the leader. Because Churchill, in these dark, dark times, certainly did not have everything his own way. By the end of June, the strategic picture within Europe had changed significantly. Now, the Czechs, the Poles, the Danes, the Norwegians, the Dutch, the Belgians, the Luxembourgers, and the French were under German control. For this quick summary of the strategic picture, I'm going to draw heavily on Robin Pryor's When Britain Saved the West, the story of 1940. This is a fascinating book that goes into a lot of detail into the strategic level machinations. The issue for Great Britain was that whilst it had the strength to probably defend itself, particularly with the strength of the Royal Navy making any invasion prohibitively expensive, Germany now had significantly more industrial resources and at some point was probably going to be able to outbuild the RAF and the Royal Navy and tip the balance of power in its favour. So now time was not on the side of Great Britain. As early as the 15th of May, Churchill was reaching out to the United States to see what assistance could be forthcoming. This is just after Premier Reynaud had called Churchill, claiming that the French were defeated. Churchill wrote, "I trust you realise, Mr. President, that the voice and force of the United States may count for nothing if they are withheld too long. You may have a completely subjugated and Nazified Europe established with astonishing swiftness, and the weight may be more than we can bear. Immediate needs are, first, the loan of 40 or 50 of your older destroyers to bridge the gap between what we have now and the large new construction that we put in hand at the beginning of the war." He went on to say, "We shall go on paying dollars for as long as we can, but I should like to think that when we can pay no more, you will give us the stuff all the same." Roosevelt responded that they couldn't transfer destroyers because he would need congressional approval and he didn't think he could get that. He didn't mention anything about a Nazified Europe or the matter of payments. Churchill ups the ante in his response back to Roosevelt. "Our intention is, whatever happens, to fight on to the end in this island. And, provided we can get the help for which we ask, we hope to run them very close in the air battles in view of individual superiority. Members of the present administration would likely go down during this process should it result adversely. But in no conceivable circumstances would we consent to surrender. If members of the present administration were finished and others came in to parley amid the ruins, you must not be blind to the fact that the sole remaining bargaining counter with Germany would be the fleet. And if this country was left by the United States to its fate, no one would have the right to blame those then responsible if they made the best terms they could for the surviving inhabitants. Excuse me, Mr. President, putting this nightmare bluntly. Churchill believed that he was making some headway with Roosevelt in getting the United States closer to entering the war. Roosevelt, on the 10th of June, in a public speech, said, "We will extend to the opponents of force the material resources of this nation, and at the same time we will harness and speed up the use of those resources in order that we ourselves in the Americas may have equipment and training equal to the task of any emergency and every defence. All roads leading to the accomplishment of those objectives must be clear of obstructions. We will not slow down or detour. Signs and signals call for full speed ahead." Churchill thought that there was an imminent declaration of war coming from the United States. However, he was disappointed. Roosevelt often made rousing speeches which led to no action. This was despite the counsel that he was getting. Henry Morgenthau, the Secretary of the Treasury, said to Roosevelt that unless we do something to give the English additional destroyers, it seems to me absolutely hopeless to expect them to keep going. And his Secretary of Labour, Harold Ickes, said that by hook or by crook, we ought to accede to England's requests. By the 31st of July, the operational situation in Great Britain had deteriorated significantly. The Battle of Britain was at its peak, and invasion was thought to be imminent. Britain had had 10 destroyers either sunk or damaged in just the last 10 days. And so he wrote to Roosevelt, "We could not keep up the present rate of casualties for long, and if we cannot get a substantial reinforcement, the whole fate of the war may be decided by this minor and easily remediable factor. I cannot understand why, with the position as it is, you do not send me at least 50 or 60 of your oldest destroyers. Mr. President, with great respect, I must tell you that in the long history of the world, this is a thing to do now." The United States would lend destroyers to Great Britain in return for leasing bases in British territories. There was one rider on the agreement, though, and that was that if Britain was to fall, it was to send the Royal Navy to the United States. Churchill was maddened by this proviso. He thought it was defeatist, and he didn't want it to be a part of the deal, but he accepted that the deal had to be done. Negotiations continued, and the deal was signed on the 2nd of September. Interestingly enough, by the end of 1940, only 9 of these destroyers were in service. And they were in such bad condition when they arrived that they had to be almost entirely rebuilt. By May 1941, only 30 were in service. This delay in getting the support to Britain meant that it faced the invasion threat with no support from the United States. The situation was worse for other material that was required for the prosecution of the war. These were being purchased on a cash and carry basis, but Britain was rapidly running out of cash. As the cash situation deteriorated, so did the carry. From January to May 1940, only 40,000 tonnes were being lost in the North Atlantic. From June to November, this increased to over 200,000 tonnes. Britain was getting close to the point where it would be unable to replace its losses in the war in the Atlantic. However, the United States was still not increasing its wartime production. And in fact, in 1940, only 3% of the American economy was devoted to wartime production. A presidential election was held in the United States on the 5th of November, and Roosevelt won the election with increased majorities in the Senate and the House. In December, Churchill wrote to Roosevelt, "The moment approaches when we shall no longer be able to pay cash for shipping and other supplies. While we do our utmost and shrink from no proper sacrifice to make payments across the exchange, I believe that you will agree that it would be wrong in principle and mutually disadvantageous in effect if at the height of the struggle Great Britain were to be divested of all saleable assets." It concluded with a table of the British shipping losses in the Atlantic. The question was now how to support Britain if they were no longer able to pay. and on the 17th of December, President Roosevelt made his decision. I've been thinking very hard on this trip about what we should do for England, and it seems to me that the thing to do is to get away from the dollar sign. I don't want to put the thing in terms of dollars or loans, and I think the thing to do is to say we will manufacture what we need, and the first thing we will do is increase our productivity, and then we will say to England, we will give you the guns and ships that you need, provided when the war is over, you will return to us in kind the guns and ships that we have loaned to you, or you will return to us the ships repaired and pay us, always in kind, to make up the depreciation. Later in the afternoon, he explained to the press that if your neighbour's house was on fire, you would not haggle over the price of the hose you were to lend him. The main thing you wanted was the fire put out and the hose returned. At this point of the war, over 60% of Americans favoured sending all possible help to Britain. This would go on to become the Lend-Lease Act. It was actually called an Act to Promote the Defence of the United States, and it was given the number 1776. That was passed on the 11th of March 1941, after 3 months of debate in Congress. Robin Pryor writes, eventually, the British received around $900 million in Lend-Lease aid by the end of 1941. This figure may be compared to the $3.2 thousand million that Britain had spent in the US by the year's end. In fact, purchases covered by Lend-Lease represented just 1% of Britain's war supplies. In stark contrast was the aid provided by Canada, which announced in December 1941 that all munitions, war supplies and food produced in Canada for Britain would be given to Britain to the extent of $1 billion. To all intents and purposes, economically as well as militarily, Britain and its empire in the period of 1940 to 41 stood alone. It was to be the Japanese strike on Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941 that would finally draw the United States into the Second World War. Churchill was finally to have the full force of the coalition that he had been working for so many months now. Germany had already betrayed the Soviet Union and had launched Operation Barbarossa on the 22nd of June 1941. Churchill, even though he was a long-term, strident anti-communist, had said, if Hitler invaded hell, I would make at least a favourable reference of the devil in the House of Commons. The guidance that came from Churchill for the British and Commonwealth defenders of Malaya and Singapore is interesting in the light of the work that he was doing to put together a coalition. He was keen to see the retention of Singapore for as long as possible, particularly a spirited defence, because he understood the importance of maintaining the morale and commitment of the newest members of the coalition. He understood the importance of maintaining that community of interest. Churchill may not have been the British centre of gravity, but he was certainly a critical requirement, because without his vision and leadership and diplomacy, there would have been no coalition between the Allied forces. And it was that coalition, the Allies, that provided the means to achieve the end state of total victory over Nazism and the Japanese Empire.
The Principles of War podcast is brought to you by James Ealing. The show notes for the Principles of War podcast are available at www.theprinciplesofwar.com for maps, photos and other information that didn't make it into the podcast. Follow us on Facebook or tweet us at Surprise Podcast. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes and tag a mate in on one of our episodes. All opinions expressed by individuals are those of those individuals and not of any organisation.